this idea of freedom, freedom from constraints, freedom from oppression, it's crept past and beyond our laws and our political and legal systems. And it's crept into our everyday life in a much more insidious and invisible way. We're sending messages to each person, including each of us, that you are the most important person in the world. That has taken the idea of freedom and, in my view, twisted it into something else. And I think that something is autonomy, which is etymologically, anthropologically and politically a very, very different beast.
I'm Rob Forsyth, and this is Liberalism in Question. Max, welcome.
Hey Rob, thanks for having me.
In this book you say that the modern concept of freedom is, in a sense, 1,000 years old in human history. Tell me about that first.
Yeah, well, freedom is not a new thing. I think politically, Rob, what we see is that it's become manifested and expressed politically relatively recently when you look through human history. It's really since we've talked about freedom as an organising principle for government and society that we have this idea of liberalism, right, which quite literally means, a system of government that's anchored around liberality, around liberty. And so we've seen, and you can track it in various different ways, and there's lots of different types of liberalism, of course.
We've found that out here, there's many types.
Many, many types. And I think a lot of the debates and arguments over, liberalism and pluralism and debate and freedoms of speech in liberalisms come about because people have different understandings of...
And probably it's a very liberal understanding of being liberal.
Okay. Correct.
You were telling me about that becoming of political freedom in history.
Yes, and so I think over the last 1,000 years, speaking very broadly, we've seen this classical idea of freedom, the freedom from oppression, the freedom from subjugation, the freedom from illegitimate hierarchical restrictions on people, from basic levels of what we all define as, now broadly speaking, at least in liberal studies, freedom.
What events 1,000 years
So
ago?
talking about the freedoms of thought and speech and conscience and association, if we look back, you could take it back to the Magna Carta, you can take it back to, even before that, some people might take it back to the ancient Greeks, take it back to the Romans. But this idea that there are certain things that people should be free to do as a matter of what we are, not what we can do. So there are fixed first principles, if you like,
Right.
That should be broadly respected, that cross cultures, that cross historical and racial and ethnic and national barriers. And thankfully, I think, in a positive way, we've seen these basic freedoms of thought and speech and association, the freedom to vote, the freedom to say and to think what we want, broadly speaking. We've seen those baked into our constitutions.
So that's only been the last 200, 300 years, has it?
Right.
In the West.
It's been a long evolution. You're absolutely right. You see glimpses of it
Yes.
through ancient history, but it's really, the rubber's really hit the road in the last few hundred years.
And I want to come to your book in a moment, but is this a particularly Western concept? I'm asking a Sri Lankan here.
Yes. Well, a lot of people track it in different ways. I think it's difficult to make sense of the modern political understanding of civil and political freedom in a Western, modern, capitalist, democratic sense without looking at least to some degree, at the Judeo-Christian understanding of the individual, looking at the intrinsic value of all people, regardless of your station in life, regardless of your gender or your race or your ethnicity or whatever it might be. So I think that has a big part to play. And I think when you look back at thinkers, and there have been so many of them that have contributed to our modern understanding of freedom, there, broadly speaking, was always some level of metaphysical, if you like, or Judeo-Christian angle to this understanding of why people should be free from illegitimate authority.
Although, and I don't want to spend too long on this, a lot of the reaction was against the power of monarchs and of the church in European society. So the ancient regime in its various forms.
Yeah, correct. So I think way back then, when we were trying to work out whether or not freedom was universal and how important it was to people, there were powers in place that might have been there legitimately or illegitimately based on your views of power, but they were violating something deep and universal in people that was broadly deemed to be unacceptable over time. And so people, for whatever reason, rose up, some in non-violent ways, some in violent ways, but rose up because this idea of freedom is on every human heart. And so while the Judeo-Christian tradition might have given voice to it, it's something that's really on every human heart. No one likes freedom being violated.
Well, if it's on every human heart, why isn't it everywhere then?
Well, I think, not to bring it back to the Judeo-Christian tradition, but the Bible makes a very good diagnosis, I think, of the human condition, and that is we are broken, each of us, and our world is broken. And so the ideals that should be out there are not always honoured or expressed.
I appreciate your point. I mean, if that's correct, we're all broken equally. In some parts of the world, freedom has flourished, relatively speaking. In others, it has not, and does not today. In fact, if anything, the rise of autocracy seems to have grown in the last 10 years.
Yes. Well, I think the brokenness of the world and the brokenness of humankind is such that you're going to get disparate outcomes, and even in places where freedom has flourished. I mean, I saw the Economist's intelligence unit suggest that there are only really 23 pure democracies left in the world. Australia happens to be one of them. That's a good thing. But I think even in those 23, there are other problems. You know, there are issues with loneliness and dysfunction.
The number of perfect society in the world is in fact, I think, roughly naught.
Right. Exactly. And so while there are people involved, nothing's going to be perfect, even a system of government.
Let me go back to your story of freedom from oppression. Now, you claim there's been a change or a new development in the idea of freedom more recently. What do you mean?
Yeah, so we've been talking about the political expressions of freedom, right, Rob? We've been talking about freedoms in our constitutions and our laws, and that's all well and good. What I think has happened more recently, and I'm certainly not the first person to have this insight, is that this idea of freedom from constraints, freedom from oppression, it's crept past and beyond our laws and our political and legal systems. And it's crept into our everyday life in a much more insidious and invisible way that is having much more tangible impact on us than we'd like to think. So it's actually crept into our shopping habits, into our live streaming habits, into how we travel, into how we think about the homes we want to buy, the cars we want to buy, the places we want to holiday. It's actually gone into everyday decision making and the elevation of what some would call expressive individualism, or Charles Taylor called it the age of authenticity, Alistair McIntyre called it emotivism. This idea that we're sending messages to each person, including each of us, that you are the most important person in the world. That has taken the idea of freedom and, in my view, twisted it into something else. And I think that something is autonomy, which is etymologically, anthropologically, and politically a very, very different beast. And I think we miss that distinction at our peril.
Okay, autonomy, self-rule.
Yes.
What's wrong with this?
So freedom, I think in and of itself is broadly a very positive thing. And yes, we've done things with it that haven't been always positive, but freedom at its best is the freedom from illegitimate constraints, and I think that's a good thing. Autonomy, as you correctly say, is from two different stem words, auto meaning self and nomos meaning law, so self-law or self-rule. So rather than being free from constraints, autonomy goes to a very different place, which tells people you are actually a law unto yourself. You're entirely a law unto yourself. There are
about everything.
About everything. There's no constraints. There's no purpose. There's no objective reference points for what you were made to be, who you could be, what you should do, how you should treat people, the ideals and first principles you should hold. That's entirely up to you. And so what we have with an autonomous society at its worst is 8 billion people walking around being told that they're their own little system of morality.
Yeah. Let me try and make a distinction here. I often make the distinction. I think it's a valid one. I think you're hinting at it here, between liberalism as a way of running our society versus liberalism as the last word on everything.
Right.
A metaphysic, if you like.
Yes.
Although I did have someone recently who actually promoted liberalism as a way of life. Fascinating conversation.
Right.
But nonetheless, that's not my own personal view. In a world in which we have different understandings of what the good life is, what is the good? A liberal society, strangely, does not arbitrate.
Yes.
So that the society will not tell you. A liberal society, oddly enough, is silent about the biggest questions in life. But that doesn't mean there are not big questions, or that individuals can do their own thing. There's a dispute of ideas.
Right.
Now, that's liberalism A, or that's tacit liberalism.
Yes.
But civic liberalism. But you're saying there's another kind of liberalism as a philosophy of life, when that's always talking about this.
Yes.
Freedom becomes the goal itself rather than the means to attend, to decide from us. We join the communities, get the traditions for the good life as I see it.
Yes.
Now, what is that distinction valid that I made?
Yeah, that's a very important...
Is that the point you're making?
That's a very important distinction, Rob, and I think it's worth just fleshing out a little the different liberalisms, because that's what your question gets at, which is the crux of the issue, I think.
It does.
And so there's any number of ways of categorising liberalisms. There's arguably an infinite number of them.
Yes. And American viewers will often be confused because we're not talking about what Americans mean by liberalism.
No, correct. And so I think for the purposes certainly of my book and in my experience, I think there are at least 4 broad liberalisms that it's helpful for people to understand. There's the kind of John Stuart Mill utilitarian liberalism that just simply seeks to optimize for happiness, optimize for utility. So there's that. There's a related one that is different, which is the Jean-Jacques Rousseau kind of liberalism in modern form, promoted by people like John Rawls and others. And that is a liberalism that talks about a general will, that people will just kind of reason their way to a particular set of first principles if you just let them. And that's kind of a social contract, kind of social democracy kind of liberalism. Then there's Edmund Burke's liberalism, which is a more conservative liberalism, which is still anchored around individual liberty and freedom, but doesn't completely throw out the idea of traditions and objective reference points and a kind of a moral order. First principles, if you like. You don't get to decide for yourself what a human being is. You don't get to decide for yourself these basic first principles. And then, I think more interestingly, there's Isaiah Berlin and his friends, which have what they call values pluralism, which is what you're talking about, where everyone actually can make up their own mind about what is good and about, you know, the non-common good is really something that people come at for themselves. Now, of these 4 types of liberalism, the last one, the Berlinian kind of liberalism, is the one that's on most modern consciousnesses, if you like, I think. But the reality is that when you say the word liberalism to people, they often are cherry-picking from these 4 categories in some way. Now, the question becomes, and the challenge for us today in 2025, as was the challenge when the Magna Carta was written, or however long you want to take it back, when the ancient Greeks were experimenting with democracy, the challenge is, at what level do we say there is something common and non-negotiable, the first principles that we all agree to, and then the rest is up to us? How high do you take that?
That's exactly. I think that's exactly.
That's how you take that. And the only real difference between different kinds of liberals, and I think you could take it as far as saying the only real difference between different opinions on the political spectrum, is whether we argue at the first principle level, the second principle level, or the third principle level.
To agree on something common, we need to have. We can't do that by compulsion.
No.
So it must be done by
consensus.
Even though we have there are people who believe in God, there are people who don't, there are people of different backgrounds. There's a whole range of decisions about the biggest. One of the problems in life is the biggest questions are the hardest to decide. The little questions like what time is it?
Correct.
And who's going to win MasterChef?
Yes.
Are trivial.
But a bit easier.
But much easier, that's right.
Yes.
That's the problem we're facing.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. The question around how we can come around a set of first principles that everyone agrees to, such that we can then have sufficient pluralism and freedom on top of that with everything else. That's the question. And I agree with you that it can't be done by compulsion, nor should it be done by compulsion. I think liberalism that compels is no longer liberalism at that point. And even looking at, take a document like the Bible that offers in my view, a great set of first principles and a moral framework on which you can build a liberal society that values a lot of the first principles that you need to run a harmonious liberal society. Even it quite clearly says to me, as a political theorist, that it envisages a good society as one where people should be allowed to believe whatever they want. Right? There's intrinsic dignity in all people, and people should have the choice to believe in God, to not believe in God, and so forth. The question is, can we still find a set of first principles around which we can coalesce, even if we believe in those first principles for different reasons?
Yes, I understand.
I think that's,
and by the
that's
way,
the key.
Your point about the Bible, I think there are some problems with it. I'm an Anglican by background and by practice, but we did not allow alternative points of view in our society until I guess the 18th century, when it broke down. It wasn't right. We even put John Bunyan in jail. Because the idea that a society can allow freedom of thought on the big issues was thought to be destructive of society. It's turned out not as bad as we thought. But there was, I think, the Roman Catholic Church is only more lately discovered religious toleration. So there's a whole trend. There is, in fact, within an overly paternalistic, oppressive trend in the history of the Church, it seems to me, that can't be overseen either. If you're right, it's in the Bible. It wasn't noticed.
I think
it wasn't noticed for many centuries. That's what I want to say.
I think that's fair. And I think it's important for us to acknowledge on a show like this that, while I don't think it's been, across the board, but there have been too many examples of the institutional church through history missing that understanding of freedom.
Can I just move from that one to the trap? Your book's provoked the freedom trap.
Yes.
What's the trap?
Yeah, so I think it comes back to this idea of autonomy. And I think if we misunderstand, Rob, the idea of freedom in its healthiest forms, then it twists itself into autonomy, and that can entrap people. And so in the book I talk about 4 examples of how that can happen. I say, if we don't understand freedom properly, we can be trapped by too much choice. We can be trapped by the consequences of our choices. We can be trapped by technology if we don't use that sensibly. And we can be trapped by society's metrics of success if we just
start with the first one.
Trapped by choice. Now, this is a pretty simple one.
But I like choice.
Yeah, I like choice too. And I think it's important that there's always nuance in these discussions. But it is quite evident in the statistics and the research that there are some aspects of our lives where too much choice is actually not healthy for us. And I use an example. I cite a famous study in social psychology on how people choose jam. And if you go to the supermarket...
Jam.
Okay. Jams, preserves, these sorts of condiments. And there was a study done, and it's a little while ago now, but I think the principle still holds, where what they found was that if you go to a supermarket where you can get on average 25 to 30 varieties of jam, and then they took a bunch of those away and just left people with the option of 5 or 6, and when they had a smaller choice on something as trivial as jam, people spent less time thinking about it, they were likely to buy more jam, they were happier afterwards, they were less anxious and stressed. Now, obviously that doesn't hold for everything. If you've got a serious medical condition...
I think there is a point at which too much
choice is better.
I mean, my example is streaming services.
Right. Well, that's another great example.
You spend the entire night thinking, what will I watch?
Yeah, and you watch previews and you test things and you end up going to bed unsatisfied.
So there's a point at which the choice is beyond the human capacity to really make it to the options.
Correct. And this might seem like a bit of a trivial everyday example, but I think it's important for the principle that living lives and seeking to build lives that just seek to maximise choices as opposed to optimise for the best choices is not always good.
And I take that point. In fact, the thought that choice in itself is a good is, in my view, an empty concept.
Right.
It's choice between what is the good.
Right.
The freedom to choose is a good, but
yes.
that I must choose, I take that point. Now, your second one was?
Second one's kind of related. It's that we can be trapped by consequences. And this is a pretty basic thing that we seem to have missed in an autonomous society, that all acts of freedom involve choices, and all choices have consequences. And you can be free to choose in the first place, but you're not free of your consequences in the second place. So I can choose not to ever brush my teeth. That's a choice I can exercise twice a day if I want. But sooner or later, the consequences of those choices will come back to me, and I won't have the choice then of being able to avoid the dentist or the orthodontist or the periodontist for very long.
Here at the CIS, we have an annual lecture called the John Jeganathan Lecture. And some years ago, the late P.J. O'Rourke, satirist and commentator, spoke, and I had one of his sayings on the board. It said this: "You're free to do whatever you damn well like, but you're not free to avoid the consequences."
Right.
Now that was a kind of a very libertarian view. Is there a sense, though, in which we do try and avoid the consequences in our society? That is, we try and deal with consequences without trying to deal with the choices that led to them.
Definitely.
In public policy,
yeah,
especially.
I think that's certainly my experience, and we don't want to sound unnecessarily judgmental, but certainly I can speak for myself, because I think this is beyond left and right, theist or atheist, Christian or whatever else you might believe. The brokenness of us as people is such that we love to have everything our way and to not have the downsides of when we choose incorrectly. I think that's just humankind at its selfish worst.
And I don't know the answer to this, but sometimes you're accused of blaming the victim when you say this outcome is something that your lifestyle choices, your choices, the taking of consequences is removed, which I think leads to a terrible breakdown in society, actually.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. That point, Rob, gets at something really important that we miss too much of. The way that we tend to connect cause and effect based on our biases, prejudices, education, backgrounds, is a very, very dangerous thing. And there are attribution errors that the behavioural economists and others talk about, that when you see something, attributing causes to that just on instinct is a very, very dangerous thing to do, because everything has a multifactorial set of causes that goes beyond usually our understanding and expertise as an observer in that moment. And so most things have a number of different causes, and so you've got to bring nuance to this. I think one of my favourite quotes is that the best definition of tyranny is the removal of nuance. And so we don't want to be tyrannical in our commentary or our understanding of each other.
Third one,
not sure if this is third or fourth, but we can be trapped by technology.
Yeah, this sounds very odd to me.
And a lot of great thinkers, far greater than me, have been talking about this for the last quarter century or so, and many long before that. This idea, and there's a theologian called Andy Crouch that writes well on this, and he makes the very sensible point that all technology that gets mainstreamed into our digitalised lives makes a lot of new things possible and faster and better. And so it's good, it should be embraced and used in that way, and no better example than a smartphone. It's connected us in ways and streamlined economies in incredible ways. But all new technology also makes some old things less possible and some old things impossible. And we have to be aware of that. And a good example, again, is the smartphone.
What's it made impossible?
It's much less likely now that someone would sit down and thoughtfully reflect and write a letter to someone that they might disagree with over something and give it the level of thought and contemplation than they used to do. Now, similarly, so that's one broader example, but there's also much less likelihood that, you know, I'm glad we're here in person together. We live in the same city, so this is possible. But perhaps even if we lived on opposite sides of the city, or our offices were on opposite sides of the city, because of Zoom, because of Teams, because of Riverside, we might have done this online.
In fact, we often do.
Right, and that's great that we can do that.
They just won't pay my airfares to London.
I know. Business class is not getting cheaper.
No.
No, I understand that. But yeah, I think that kind of
but the point you're making
embodied experience is we're losing a bit of that.
I take your point, but surely it's with respect, an obvious point that there are ups and downs with all new technologies. And in fact, people have been complaining about industry ever since it came somewhere.
Of course.
Moaning about the loss of... there's been a kind of cultural objection to technology right back to the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, it seems to me. And I guess they're right, things are lost. I'm not as sympathetic to them because the increase in human well-being in death rates, in nutrition. There's just been, in fact, I think if you do a graph over the income per head, it goes like that since the days of the Roman Empire and our Christ, and then suddenly you find this remarkable growth.
No, you're spot on.
Very positive.
You're spot on. It's explosive growth. It's just lifted billions out of poverty.
And we humans typically,
and
we had Matt Ridley on some time ago on this program, the rational optimist, saying that no, it's bad news we like. Good news is not good news. No one reads a book on good news. It's the downside, and that's because by nature we need to be warning against natures. So is not this slightly overdone, my point?
Yeah, look, I think we have to be careful. We don't want to just paint a big broad brush, because I think certainly in net terms technology has been a positive thing for humankind. I don't think I would definitely not make an alternate point to that. But I think we do need to be careful with how some technology can actually have negative effects that we negate and ignore at our peril. And I don't think we should put those technologies aside.
No, I'll buy that.
I think we should think more carefully at how we use them.
It may be some moral panic here, but the social media effect on young people, right, it'd be very deleterious. Jonathan Haidt and others drawn to it.
Right, in the Anxious Generation, things like that.
Although I think it's a lot of fiction, it shouldn't be taken, though it's a documentary, and the film Adolescence at least points to that issue, even though I think there are issues about it which I don't think are entirely helpful. There is a problem. This is a downside of our technology.
Yeah. So we just need to get the downsides right, and we need to bring nuance to that debate. And I think it is interesting, that while I think, broadly speaking, it's benefiting all of us, it's going to lift, all boats. The tide will lift all boats in an economic and an intellectual and a connectedness sense. There are interesting stats that come out from young people, and most of them that I speak with. I was speaking to a social researcher and trend theorist the other day who said that 58% of young people think that social media has been a net negative for them, but something like 90+% will continue to use it.
Yes.
So there are challenges, and we just have to come to them in a thoughtful way.
And that's anecdotal, but what it's done to open markets to people in Africa and elsewhere, right, it's just been an astounding change in human flourishing. I take it there's downside for others.
And that's not anecdotal, that's quantitative analysis.
That's what and in fact, this whole area is full of dangers of anecdotal. Yeah. And the last one was...
the last one is an interesting one. The last one is that if we're not careful, we can be trapped by the metrics of success that society pitches up.
Oh, I wouldn't mind being trapped by that.
Yes, I know. Well, I wouldn't mind being trapped by them if I had all of them.
Now, what do you mean the metrics of success?
And this is a bigger, broader, probably separate podcast interview, and a separate book.
I'll get you back.
Okay, but I do mention at least 4 things that are worth thinking about in this space: achievement, accumulation, status, and experience. And these 4 things that's not an exclusive or an exhaustive list, but that's broadly what modern society thinks a successful person has in large part. And that's in and of itself a good thing. We should be striving for those things. But the danger is, if we think that we are truly free in our day-to-day decision making without being aware of those metrics. So if someone, for example, gets 99.95 in their Year 12 exams and can do anything they want, for them to be purely driven by those 4 metrics, what's going to optimize for my financial wealth or for my status, that can become problematic if that's all you've got without the first principles under it.
Okay, there are often unacknowledged channels the society produces. It has to, in a sense.
Of course it does. And every society does it.
Yeah.
Every society does it.
Unacknowledged, you can think you're free, but actually you're following it.
Yeah, as long as you're aware. And that's why, I set down, as you know, Rob, towards the end of the book, a few life hacks.
Now, I want to come to this because our time's getting closer.
Right.
We've got the problem, we've analysed Western society very well.
Yes, in 30 minutes.
Yeah. What advice do you have? You try and be positive at the end, I noticed.
I try and be positive, and I try and be as base level and practical as I can. The book is not supposed to be an abstract contemplation on freedom as a philosophical concept. It's really a book about decision making in everyday life. And so I suggest some very basic things that might strike many people as overly simplistic, but I think I'm okay with that because I see the shortage of that and the deficiency of that in everyday life, including my own. And so what I suggest is, if we do things simply as simple as slowing down and paying attention, as being kinder to each other in a more intentional and proactive way, investing in relationships, and thoughtfully limiting choice where we can on the right things, then I think that just will go some way to us.
Say those again.
So limiting choice.
Limiting choice.
Limiting choice where we can. So Barack Obama said an interesting thing, that he only wore 2 suit colours for his entire presidency. He just alternated between dark blue and black. And when asked why, he said, well, I'm making some pretty big decisions every day. I don't want to waste decision-making capacity or time or stress.
In other words, reducing overthinking, basically.
Reducing overthinking on things that don't matter that much. I think on big things we should be thinking as much as we can, but reducing choice where it makes sense too. Being kind and investing in relationships is a bit, it should be self-evident, but I don't think it's practiced enough in society.
It's something I think we all acknowledge.
That's right.
And who would say, no, I'm against that. But the actual taking it seriously is much more difficult.
Taking it seriously is difficult, right? Certainly is for me. And as a Christian, I think the Christian moral framework sets down a beautiful parameter that really supercharges and guides freedom well, and that's love. And so I talk a bit about that in those 2 hacks of just being kinder to people and investing in authentic relationships with people.
So you're really giving the base values, I think. You believe in freedom, but freedom to be expressed in love, freedom to be expressed in prioritising choice.
Yeah.
Right. There were 2 more. 4, wasn't there 4 again?
Yeah. So there was being kinder to people, investing in relationships, limiting choice. The 4th and final one is, which I think I list first in the book, is just to slow down and pay attention. And obviously, as biased as I am, I think a good way to start that is to have a read of my book. But just to be aware of...
And what about self-promotion? Is that one of the things we should be...
No, I haven't touched that in the book. That's in the sequel. I hope people buy that one too.
More seriously.
More seriously. So I think just slowing down and being aware of some of these moving parts. I think being aware that society does have metrics and measures of success. Being aware that we have much more coming at us through our screens in terms of input into our eyes and our ears than we used to. Just being aware of those things will just put us in a better place to make sure we get our relationships right, our vocation right, our
another way to put this, that freedom needs wisdom.
That's right.
And by itself, freedom is good, but cannot be an only good without wisdom, I think.
That's exactly right. And that's where I land, Rob.
And I think that's what... I think that's my view of classical liberalism. I stand more in a bit of a Burkean, if you must know.
Sure.
I think that we need to give a vote to our ancestors and their thinking, and don't just think.
Yep.
Don't change something unless you know why it's there.
Right.
And be very cautious about the human capacity to start with a blank sheet and produce the perfect outcome. This has been a disaster in human history, not respecting other constraints.
Yes.
In other words, there's a constrained understanding of freedom. I think is crucial as well. Well, Max, great to have you around today to talk about this. I hope you do produce that 2nd book on all the things that are missing.
We'll see how we go. But thank you for having me, Rob. I really appreciate it.
I'm Rob Forsyth. This is Liberalism in Question. Thanks for watching.